My encounter with Dogman was when I was 7 years old. I was out by the horses by our barn, and we had an old car up on blocks. We used to put hay in it, since it was long past its prime for the horses. My brothers were throwing hay down, and I was running around, looking, and in the corner of my eye, there was this man-like beast. He walked like a man but was covered in hair. It stood pretty tall, and when I saw it, I immediately ran inside screaming. Nobody believed me. They all thought it was my brother playing a prank on me, because when they came out, there was no evidence, like tracks or anything. We went back outside, and the horses were going crazy. I told them something big had spooked the horses, but my dad informed me I should stop telling stories and go back inside. I didn't see it again, but my mom saw it walking by the road late one night. She was driving home from work, and she said it looked like a giant, hunched-over dog, sniffing at things as it went off. She wouldn't admit this to my father, of course. He had a habit of being a drunk and would have blamed her for being on the road so late at night. When I asked my father about it, he said he didn't know what I was talking about. Of course, he had heard my mom's story. When he mentioned my mom's story, his face turned ghost white. So, there. It makes me believe there is a creature out there somewhere like this. I'm just not sure when and what. I'm sorry if my email doesn't make much sense. I try to do my best to put it into words that would portray what I felt. You can always email me back if you have any questions. Best of luck, and I'll give you full permission to use this story. When I was 17 years old, I had an encounter I would never forget. I was living on my own at the time, just recently emancipated, working at a factory that focused on making small metal items. I was on the night shift, and back then, it seemed to me that factory workers were always underpaid and had longer than usual hours. It wasn't great, but it got me some underage beer money in my pocket every week. I usually left for work around 3 a.m. sharp. The building had an open bay door facing west. So basically, you walked out the door, walked 3 steps headed west towards your car or house, depending on where you lived. On this particular night, I ran into my friend who worked there with me, as well as his girlfriend, heading for their cars, parked roughly 50 feet apart. We all nodded to each other after a lengthy conversation before I could even turn around. Something caught my attention. I had this feeling, not unlike something watching me, but I ignored it and simply kept walking to my vehicle. When I looked back again, the thing was still there, only closer now, maybe only 30 feet away, staring right at me with these glowing orange eyes. It stood there, motionless, and in one quick moment, I screamed, running to my car and driving. When I told my friend about it the next night, he just looked at me like I was crazy. I ran into this thing again at our factory just a few months later. I was working the 3rd shift, so everything was always quiet around this time. Now, this was right around 4 a.m. on the loading dock. I walked out back to my car, and it was there again. Those same glowing orange eyes, now about 20 feet away, standing next to one of those trash dumpsters that are huge. You know, the huge steel boxes used to store empty metal drums before they're shipped out. It gets better, or worse. It shouted, something really loud in some other language. It sounded like it was demon tongue, if I could imagine. All I know is, it sounded evil. Right after that, it began running towards me, and I jumped in my car and left as fast as possible, even though I was still technically on my shift. I didn't care. The next day, I quit the job. No way I was going to work with that thing. And my friend finally believed me and stopped asking why I got all of a sudden freaked out and left. I just thought everybody would like to know there's more than one. They all seem pretty similar in appearance, and they're definitely scary. I live in an area that is known for getting a lot of different types of animals. Coyotes, which we see quite often, and bears. But recently, my brother has seen some strange creatures in the same places where he lives, which seems to be odd because it isn't really populated or anything like that. In fact, last week when he was home from work, he told me about one of the creatures that he himself had seen. Said he was walking back to his truck after getting off work, and he saw something running towards him. At first, he assumed it was a large dog. He's familiar with most animals, of course. But as the figure got closer, he noticed some very distinctive features. He said that it looked like a canine, but it had these super long front legs which made its body lean forward, and the creature kind of moved like a gorilla, almost like how it would move if its bones were broken. He said that its skin was also straight black and shiny, but kind of reminiscent of coal. It looked extremely creepy. I asked my brother what exactly happened after he saw this creature. He said that it stopped short of him, about 20 feet away. It stared at him for a while, but my brother was so freaked out by this point, he left to go inside his house. I'm not really sure what these creatures are. I just know that they're very strange in nature, almost like some type of experimental animal, or something like that. My encounter goes back to the fall of 1987. I was a young man who had just graduated from high school. I had never attended college. But since it was my dream to be an officer, I took a job as a deputy sheriff's dispatcher in a very small town where I grew up. The department was hardly busy at all, so we pretty much did our own thing for hours on end. I usually worked a dispatch by myself at night. Most of the guys went off shift right after their shift ended, and were not available to relieve me when they were done. Also, if somebody got into trouble somewhere else, we would always have to call over there and get them to cover that shift until someone could come back on another car. This is how it happened. I was working dispatch alone that night, and after a while, it got pretty quiet. That's pretty usual. There wasn't much going on at all besides normal stuff. At this time of night around here is always a lot of farm machinery being operated, especially since fall was harvest season after all. These guys are usually always out late, and they work so hard during the day getting their crop in to be able to feed their livestock or sell them for a profit. Also, a few farmers would also tend to hunt at night, during bow season actually, and I had my fair share of those calls as well. It was about 3:30 in the morning when one of these hunters called me, telling me he had just shot at a strange creature trying to attack his livestock. He sounded very excited on the phone, told me it had long black hair, standing about 10 feet tall, weighing roughly 400 to 500 pounds. He also said that he hit it a few times with his .30-06 rifle, chased after him until this creature retreated, climbing up a large oak tree and disappearing. And after that, he lost sight of it, came back to call me. At first, I thought this guy had been sipping some moonshine, or was just full of it. I mean, how could you believe somebody who claims they shot at a bigfoot? But I humored him and went out there myself to check things out. Now, I saw where this thing had been apparently climbing the tree. It looked or appeared to be large finger marks dragging through the bark. There were also several places in the yard where it looked like this thing had bedded down possibly, probably waiting for the right time to strike. I also saw the fur on the ground where he claimed it had been bedding down. It was also dark out, but the moonlight kept everything illuminated enough to see. The fur was very strange looking. It looked to be about 4 to 5 inches long, and it had a stank to it. I didn't touch it or anything. I didn't want to disturb any possible clues that might help us find whatever this thing was. Clearly, we were dealing with some sort of large animal. Now, the animal control officer, who also doubled as a game warden, and myself went around and looked at all the livestock. Everything seemed fine, and there were no broken locks on any of the pens or doors. It seems like whatever this thing was, it got spooked by my hunter and came after him instead. Whatever it was, we never found out what kind of creature it could have been. We also did not find any tracks or anything that could really help us identify it. Now, I never talked about this encounter to anybody until later. I was working dispatch alone at the sheriff's office one evening, and a trooper came in to use the phone. He overheard me telling some hunters what had happened, so he saddled up next to me while I was writing a report and told me a very similar story. He said that when he was going through training for law enforcement, they were being taught at how to shoot and aim properly. If you aim at the heart, you have a better chance of killing it with one shot. His instructors also informed him that if you do shoot in the heart area, there is still a chance the bullet will not pierce the heart and it will not be a fatal wound. Now, he said he had to use this with a creature he dealt with that was ultimately terrifying. Having resembled a bear, having a long snout and a head similar to that of a bear, but it was not a bear. He said that it stood on 2 legs and was roughly over 7 feet tall. Neither one of us really knew what to make of this, so we shrugged it off. I've worked in law enforcement now for over 30 years, spent a lot of my time in the city, but I did spend some time doing some road patrol in the country when I first started out. Over time, though, both me and my wife wanted to settle down somewhere peaceful, so we moved out here to get away from all the hustle and bustle of city life. Even though some things can be pretty quiet around here too, there are still enough calls that keep us busy most days. There is always something going on around town if you know where to look or who to ask. But if you ask the wrong person about what they know, they'll probably just give you a story that's even stranger than whatever you were looking for in the first place. Ever since we moved here, me and my wife have had numerous encounters with all sorts of strange creatures. I'm not just talking about dogs or deer either. This town has a rich history of weird things going on. It doesn't even seem weird to us anymore when we get called out somewhere, because we both know there is always something hiding under the normal circumstances. We will be getting another chance at proving this soon enough, because, as I said earlier, something big is coming. This happened in the winter of 2009. My wife, kids, and I had just moved to Minnesota. It was our first winter there. We lived in a town called Norwood, Young America. The day after Christmas, I decided to take my youngest daughter sledding on a big hill right by a river. At this time of year, everything is really dead, and there wasn't much snow, maybe 5 inches. But we still went up and slid down anyway. The following evening, I took my other daughter sledding at the same place. When we got about halfway down the hill, we were surprised by a very large, wolf-like animal coming from the woods near the river. It came running at us on 2 legs and stopped, maybe 30 feet away. I immediately grabbed my daughter off her sled and placed her behind me as we watched it, standing there looking at us. I'm not sure why this happened or what it was, but I know that neither of my daughters have ever been sledding since then. It didn't appear to be sick or injured in any way, i.e., mangy, thin, or limping, just very large and muscular, with long grayish fur. Its face reminded me like a German shepherd's, but longer, and a more pointy snout. Its ears were perked up, like they would be on a dog, but it was just standing there, motionless. The only thing I can think of is that it might have been watching us sledding earlier, and maybe wasn't expecting to see two adults with children in a second day in a row at the same particular time. Maybe it thought we were encroaching on its territory. Anyway, my daughters still talk about the Dogman to this day. They are both in college now, and neither of them want to go sledding ever again, at least around these parts. I was in the town of Fergus Falls, Minnesota, hunting. I had stopped to look at 3 deer when I noticed something crouching behind a tree on my side of the road. It appeared like it was stalking the deer, and my gut told me this thing was not human or dog-like, so I drove away before getting too close for comfort. I pulled up my binoculars and went back to investigate. What happened next would terrify me. The creature blinked its eyes but did not move when it stared into mine through the binoculars. I completely panicked, fleeing the scene. And there was only one track leading up to the tree, but it didn't show any toes, just forefinger-like canine marks in the snow. In fact, the prints themselves were like large canine prints. I've seen plenty of coyote, bear, and deer prints, but this was unlike anything I'd ever seen. And there were no claws in the print, or identifiable indentations between the toes. I've been told by some Dogman researchers that this could potentially be a Dogman, although I'm not quite sure what it is. I was thinking maybe a Wendigo or something else entirely. I do know this thing was very tall, thick, with large shoulders, and had a very slender waist. It seemed agile enough to leap out of the tree into my path if it wanted. I wonder what would have happened if that creature decided to get up and come after me. Who knows? But it's definitely spooked me enough to buy a second firearm. I'm not sure what the creature was, but I had a scary encounter with it. It was animal-like and about 8 to 9 feet tall. Dark brown fur all over its body, long arms, and appearing to have hands like a human, or opposable thumbs. When I first saw it, the deer ran off when they saw me coming to my truck. The creature then looked at me from behind a tree for several seconds until I drove away, scared out of my wits. This thing was humongous and looked to be the size of a freakishly large football player. It was staring at me from behind a tree at first, then stepping out into full view. It scared the heck out of me. It looked like a wild man or something with long arms, no neck, and it had shoulder-length dark brown hair covering its body. This thing leapt out into view, and wow, I really wasn't expecting something this big. I spotted this blackish-brown hulk for about 10 seconds or so as it dashed across the road in front of my vehicle, very quickly. I hardly had enough time to register or process what I'd seen. I've heard of Bigfoot, but I didn't think I'd ever actually seen one before in my life. When I spotted the hulk for the first time, I was driving up this road, which has patches of grass and weeds off to one side. So this thing ran across my path in front of me, just as I was coming around a bend in the road. It startled me when all of a sudden, right before my eyes, there's just this huge black mass there. Once it had ran across, it dropped down onto some tall grass on the other side, which is why, afterwards, I wasn't sure where it went. There were also several deer grazing by the nearby woods, including one little fawn, which appeared to have been separated from its mother. I should also state that as soon as I got out of my truck, a warning growl came from not far behind me. I didn't see anything at first. As I turned around, there was also a dog-like creature, roughly 8 feet tall, with black fur, roughly 20 yards away. It too had very broad shoulders and long, hawked legs. Now this creature was completely different than the one I had just seen. The creature's face looked like a stretched out wolf, more exaggerated features, but very human-shaped eyes, slanted as well. The color of its eyes are the same. It's a murky gray, if I can describe it right. Its eyes seem to be veiled in darkness, and words can't express the total fear I felt as I had to get back in my truck immediately. So I did, and left as fast as I could. I understood the warning that was coming from this creature. This was a really big man-like creature too, having blackish brown hair all over its body, and it too stopped at the edge of the woods where I could not see it anymore. I'm not really certain what to make of all this. As I'm driving off, it let out this ear-splitting howl, and that alone scared me half to death. I'm not certain what these creatures are, or even if they're real, but after seeing it, experiencing it, and reading many reports of similar sightings, I think they may be very real. I'm just trying to come to terms with reality. I had gone camping years ago in the Ozark Mountains. I was staying with my best friend and his family. We were having a barbecue on the bank of one of the lakes. After dinner, we were telling stories when one of their friends told us about something he had seen not too long ago. He said that there are tunnels in this mountain, used by an unknown tribe before being taken over by settlers. These tunnels are now blocked off by collapsed rocks, but if you know where to go, you can find entrances into them that people have found over time, just small crevices here and there. When he was younger, he would go exploring in these caves and tunnels with another person from his school who, at the time, lived near him. They had gotten lost for hours without flashlights, trying to find their way back out, or at least somewhere they could see outside. They finally found a small hole that opened up into somebody's property. He did not recognize who it was, but there were horses, so they decided to knock on the door and ask for help. The person who had apparently lived there told them there was no way they could have gotten in from where they came, because he should have been able to hear or see them. He also told them, even if you did find your way inside, you will see the old abandoned mines, and they are very dangerous. You wanted to be careful, because apparently there's been talk of the bear man living inside of them. Now, the bear man is described as being this monstrously large creature, and has legends talking about it eating humans, living in those same tunnels. There are also strange accounts of sounds coming from within them, with no explanation as to what they could be from. Sounds that are not remotely human. The friend told us that he and his other friend heard growling, walking along inside the tunnels. Couldn't find anything or anyone when they went to investigate. I remember my friend also saying there's no such thing as a bear man, and we ended the conversation there. Not much else being said. This friend and I went camping again the very next week. He decided to tell me more about what he saw in these tunnels, and kept talking about this bear man. So, I told him to show me where they went into them, because if there really was a giant bear man that lived down there, I wanted to see if I could see it with my own eyes, and possibly get pictures, hoping it wasn't too dark, of course. We made plans for the following weekend, which gave us time to plan out how we were going to get down there without being caught. We would go in at night, when everybody else had gone home or back inside their houses, and come out after dark when the sun had already set. He showed me exactly where he found tunnels on an older map his dad had. We planned it all out, packed our gear, and left for the mountains on a Friday night, right around 7, with flashlights, knives, water bottles, and extra clothes and backpacks. The spot was only 10 minutes up the highway from where we lived. It didn't take long for us to get there at all. We drove down a small dirt road that led into a field close to the cavern entrance, parked as far away as we could without getting stuck in mud. He said that somebody comes through here every day to look for people who are not supposed to be here. We should try not to leave any evidence. Right before we got out of his truck, he told me something even more unsettling than what I had already heard. He claimed that when he was younger, his friends and him were exploring the tunnels again, and they had found some sort of netting or some sort of sigil that had been left behind by somebody in the past. But before they can figure out who it belonged to, and they heard something large, heavy breathing behind them, coming in their direction. They all ran out of the tunnels very fast, without the remote possibility of looking back. We both got our flashlights out and ready, started walking towards where he remembered seeing this hole when he first came down here years back. As soon as my boots touched the ground, I knew we had made landing. I looked down at what I had stepped on, but I didn't see anything unusual, just dark rock. I kept going. In this moment, everything appeared fine. We made our way over to the other side of the tunnel and started walking into it. Immediately, I noticed a drastic change in temperature. Once we went through that narrow part where there's no light, the cold air from outside was gone. When we came up to this area, which had some light coming in from cracks on top of us, I asked him if he remembered seeing anything out of the ordinary here. He told me he didn't remember seeing anything, but what does that prove? At this point, I don't think even I would have believed him about the whole bearman thing. We continued until we got past this really dark section, and then we found it. The gap between the rocks where you could easily slip through and find yourself in these tunnels. This is also where he said he had started hearing growling and footsteps behind him before, when they were exploring down here years ago. After a quick surveying of the area for this bearman that was supposedly in here with us, I looked at my friend's face to see if he was nervous or scared, but all I saw was excitement. He went first, shined his flashlight in front of me into the entrance of these tunnels, and jumped through the cracks. Once you actually get inside, it's way more amazing than I thought it would have been. Imagine your standard cave, but bigger. Taller ceilings, tons of rock formation, stalactites and stalagmites. Once we got further inside the cavern, it's like it got very dark, even darker than pitch blackness. We continued to look around for a little bit more, just in awe of all these beautiful rock formations and tight spaces. Not everywhere you go will let you find things like this. We went deeper and deeper, and then we began to hear something in one direction. So we kind of walked over that way to see if it was anything. Because what else were we supposed to do? We didn't get very far before he hushed me, told me to stop. And again, we could hear something. But this something was now very noticeable. Footsteps. He stopped and stood completely still for a moment, just to see if it would happen again. Nothing. We began walking. We did not have much light left to explore in this cave anymore, so we decided to find the way out and head home. I could tell he was disappointed. He always wanted to do things that scared him. We got back over to where we thought the entrance should be and followed it until we came upon a dead end. So, we tried going back the other way, but even with our lights shining as far down as they would reach, there was no sign of anything or any other opening anywhere. At some point during all of this, my friend heard these really deep growls coming from some direction behind us, and we were starting to panic now. We thought the entrance was back this way, but we were clearly wrong. The growls began getting louder and more menacing sounding. Now we ran as fast as we could without looking back. and we began to hear something large and heavy start to follow us. And my friend had said that when he looked back, he would see flashes of red eyes staring right at us through the darkness. Of course, I was too scared to look behind us. He said he could also hear something very large moving after us in the same direction. Fortunately, we turned right at the necessary fork and ran until we found it, the sliver of an entrance. And we could still hear something large quickly moving back in our direction, probably no more than 50 yards out from us, coming straight for us. We both made it out and never went back in there after that. I'm not sure what it was chasing us, but I can guarantee you this wasn't no sleeping bear. This was something else. I can't imagine what it could have been. I have no idea what would make something like that underground in the first place, but it freaked both of us out. I'm not really sure how to explain this either, but I could have sworn while we were in there, you could just, at least in points, get this overwhelming presence of evil. It was so hard for me to pinpoint if it was in one direction or the other, and I began hearing these loud growls coming from deep inside this tunnel. My friend jumped through with his flashlight, shined it inside. It was really hard to pinpoint exactly where and throughout this cave you would feel this presence, but it was there. With how tight the rock formations were, could it be possible that maybe something really bad was living back there? All I know is there was no way this was a person. Could it have been the bear man? I don't know. This happened on March 5th, 2012, at around 7:30 p.m. It was dark, already due to it being near dusk when I left for the movie theater. The movie theater is a little over a 10-minute walk from my house. I had gone to the movies by myself and was on my way back home when it happened. I live in a very normal town. It's not too big or small, but there are plenty of houses everywhere you look. Lots of people around during most times of the day, since the only thing that really stands out is our local supermarket. This story takes place during the early months of spring, in the suburbs about 15 minutes away from downtown. The grass from nearby lawns can be seen growing slightly due to warmer weather, which mixes with the trees' budding leaves, while squirrels and birds take up residence in their nests. And as I said, I was walking home from the movies. It had gotten dark by this time, but not entirely pitch black. While walking past my neighbor's house, which is really close to my own, I noticed something in the inside of my vision, moving very quick across the road into a small patch of trees that separate our houses. At first, it looked like someone wearing all black with reflective tape on their arms and legs. But when I really paid attention to what was happening, I realized exactly what it was. A large dog, shaggy hair running out from behind some hedges near my neighbor's house onto the street in front of me. I only saw it for a few seconds before it ran into the trees. My memory of what exactly happened is limited. The thing I clearly saw was that this creature had an extra set of eyes on it. It went straight into the woods after turning around once to face me, with those two eyes staring me down as it continued to run. It kind of reminded me of an arachnid, because its eyes weren't normal. There were multiple sets of them, on its head and chest, or so it appeared. This thing was evil, taunting me, even though it was probably just shining due to having more light out there than usual. After what couldn't have been more than 3 seconds after it first appeared, this creature completely disappeared behind trees. I stood there in the dark after it ran off into the woods for a few seconds, my heart pounding, not being able to continue. The entire encounter was very brief, but it made me extremely uncomfortable, which is why I am sharing this story, so people can know what really happened. And that's all that really happened. It didn't attack me or anything, but due to its glowing eyes and the evilness of it, I have no doubt whatsoever about what it was. Even though some people might claim Dogman doesn't exist, all I saw were those eyes, multiple of them, staring back at me. I'm here to tell the story and not argue about what it really was, since the term Dogman is a good enough explanation for me. What do you think it could have been? I've never heard about Dogman having multiple sets of eyes. This was in a cold night, in a very isolated area. We were on dirt roads, surrounded by trees and the silhouettes of mountains. I had been told that this place didn't have cell service, and that if we were to get into trouble, we'd be on our own for at least 6 hours before somebody could come and get to us. That gave me chills as soon as those words left his mouth. But I had come too far with this story to turn back now. The story about my first Dogman encounter. I had researched these sightings heavily since first hearing of them only a month ago, and one thing always seemed to pop up. Follow any road deep enough into the wilderness, and after a few miles, you'd eventually come across the creatures. This was their territory. It was this advice that brought us out here tonight. My friend had been following these creatures for some time now, documenting their movements and behavior in his spare time. He knew of specific sightings in this part of Kentucky, figured that if we bait them with something they're known to hunt close by, then maybe we ourselves could get a closer look at them than anybody has ever gotten before. Was this dangerous? Oh, 100%. Anyway, we made camp for the first night and tried to get some sleep around 3:30 a.m. I was so tired after driving most of the day, but my friend had been up all night looking for more sightings in the area. An hour later, he nudged me awake. The man was manic, told me to grab my equipment. "We're going on a hunt," he said, while assembling his camera gear. After being groggy and had only slept for an hour, we walked into the forest, slowly approaching an open field where we could see through the trees and catch them feeding if they were still out here. He didn't think of them as cryptids. He thought of them as just wild animals that were rare but could still have the possibility of being observed. Even though it was dark, I could tell that something wasn't quite right once we set foot on that field. It's like the gravity and atmosphere itself had changed here, like every object's weight was triple what it should have been, including ours. I tried to shake the feeling and keep moving forward, but something about this place just did not feel natural. "Did you see that?" he asked me. I stopped in my tracks and looked around for what he was talking about. Nothing seemed out of place, but crunch, snap, crunch. It sounded like footsteps, or something walking near the tree line. But when I turned to get a better look, I couldn't find anything there at all. No shadows or movement, other than the branches swaying in the wind. Had this just been my imagination? We stood there in complete silence for several moments before we finally began recording video. That's when it happened. I saw something I still have trouble believing today. It was dark, but there was no mistaking what I saw emerge from the darkness towards us. From one moment to the next, I could see it clearly. A creature, taller than both of us, with this kind of iridescent green glow, fur covering most of its body that looked like a wolf's coat. But I knew right away this wasn't just some strange wolf variant, not by any stretch of the imagination. This thing had human-like arms with clawed, wickedly sharp fingers protruding through its skin, and they were big. Massive hands, fingers, claws, whatever it was. You could tell right away this wasn't normal. And then there was its head, which was pointy on top with a muzzle, full of sharp teeth. It didn't even look like it belonged on the same body. We stood there in complete silence as it stared at us for what seemed like an eternity. Honestly, I couldn't believe my eyes. Was this really happening? Was I finally going to catch proof of these mysterious creatures that have supposedly been spotted all across North America for centuries now? And then the monster bowed its head down towards some small grass behind us, started breathing heavily, like it was labored. It moved some branches aside with its hands before crouching down low on all fours, bolting back into the darkness. So fast, you'd think it had never been there at all. That's when I checked my camera and saw that we had been recording for nearly 5 minutes. I was so in shock from what I had just seen. All I could do was stand there in disbelief while my friend frantically shoved me along with his equipment towards the spot where it had just crouched down. "Come on, we gotta catch up with it," he said, snapping me out of my trance-like state. "No way. This one is a story right here," I told him. He looked at me with a dead serious face, begging me to come along. He needed hard evidence for this encounter. If we did not move quickly, this creature might get, and who knows when we'd get another chance to find it again. I don't know why I listened to him, but that's what happened. We both ran into the darkness of the forest after that thing. We ended up losing it after a few moments, and then having no real way to track it. But we had the next best thing: footage. We just needed to get it up on the internet for proof. We ran back home as quickly as we could that night, uploading the footage. But when we reviewed it, the footage looked like garbage, and ultimately wasn't worth even uploading. Sure, you can faintly see this thing from the angle, and us not really paying attention. There just wasn't near enough detail of this thing to constitute as an actual sighting. I guess that's what happens when you're too busy being in shock to worry about the proper details. We sat there trying to figure out what we should do now, but none of our ideas made sense until my friend said something that I wish he had not. "I know. Let's go back tomorrow night. Look around the area for anything unusual." And like an idiot, I let him convince me to try this, even though I knew it wasn't a good idea at all. The next day, we spent researching these same creatures online, checking up on past sightings in the area. There was one sighting around 50 years ago, not far from where we saw this creature. An old hunter, apparently by the name of Ronald, had told local authorities that he had seen one of these entities while hunting in the forest. The only reason it was so far back is because people didn't believe him at first, until his body was found torn apart by what they described as a bear. But we all know how that works out. After reading that story, I knew right then and there that we were walking into a death trap if we really did decide to go looking around for this thing ourselves. God only knows if we ran into more than one. But it wasn't like I could have stopped my friend. He wouldn't listen to anyone, ever since finding out about this whole Dogman phenomenon. We went into the forest again that night, armed with 2 cameras instead of 1. One for me and one for him. Our zoom lenses, plenty of spare batteries and memory cards, and we even had a shotgun with us. I think we were both pretty scared, but we were still confident. I mean, you can't blame either one of us for that. If there was ever a good time to test out the gun's shell ejection system, with no pellets inside, it would have been now. Because after about an hour of walking through the darkness of the forest, without finding anything, my friend, so pumped up on adrenaline, shot up into the air and screamed like he had won some kind of lottery or something. He was always doing weird, crazy stuff like this when we went on these little trips. So I was already used to it by now. I waited for him to come back down from his shooting spree high. After finally coming back down and looking around again, he started to freak out. Did you see that?" He whispered loudly into my ear while trying his best not to scream this time. I don't know why I didn't, but I just nodded and asked him what had happened. By the expression on his face alone was enough for me to ask another question, one which would have been answered if we had only listened to our guts in the first place. He finally got around to telling me about what he saw when he shot off his gun. "I thought I saw something moving through the trees near where your camera is set up." He told me with a tone of seriousness in his voice, instead of his usual excitement. That's when I fired at it, and the shots went right through the trees, and I saw this thing in the tree looking down at me. Then it disappeared. No matter how afraid I was at that point, I still had to try and not laugh at him for thinking he saw something when nothing was there. But this time, his imagination worked out pretty well. I definitely heard something rustling around in the forest. Maybe my camera caught it too. So, without hesitation, we both ran over to where my camera is set up, hopes of rewinding back through the footage to find some sign of whatever just scared us a couple of moments ago. But as soon as we got there, before my eyes could even adjust to what little light there is nearby, a big gust of wind came rushing through, blowing everything around us. And when my eyes finally adjusted, I saw that our cameras were completely dead. The air around us feeling extremely static-filled, almost electrifying. The same way right before an actual thunderstorm. "Oh God," my friend whispered. Now he was shaken up, because we realized at this point there was no good reason this shouldn't have happened. The day had turned out to be one messed up nightmare. I began focusing my attention on the wind, only to discover that it's not actually just wind making all the trees swaying back and forth. It was something massive, moving in front of us and right above our heads. So, without any second thought, I grabbed my friend by the hand and started running in any direction I could, leaving behind all of our equipment. I could care less. We ran for what seemed like an hour, but really it was probably only 10 minutes. We finally collapsed and stopped. I checked my watch, only to discover that it was nearly midnight. Once again, we pull ourselves up off the ground and continue on our way out of this forest, back towards civilization. Although, we had a ways to go. We must have covered a few kilometers without even realizing it. After walking about another 10 or so minutes, we heard growling like you could never imagine. We had left behind everything, our shotgun, camera, equipment, in the pursuit of fear. We just wanted to run as fast and as far away from that horrific creature as we could. But even on a full sprint, the growling was getting progressively closer until it seemed like it was right behind us. I looked over my shoulder after gasping for air, only to see its bright green eyes illuminated with its face, looking extremely demonic, as if it had some kind of night vision. I swore, those eyes were following me long after I lost sight of that horrid thing. We lost it at some point and made our way out of the forest, being kilometers away from where we originally entered in, and now it was long past midnight. So, with almost no cars or people anywhere out here, we just started walking down the middle of this road, under the street, under the stars. All of a sudden, my friend let out an ear-splitting scream, and when I looked up to see what was wrong, there it was again, only this time standing right on the woodline of the same forest, which made me realize these things can travel way faster than you think they could, and they are just likely toying with their prey before they kill us. I lost all hope after seeing it. I couldn't run away from it again if I wanted to. My legs were about ready to collapse underneath my weight, but it quickly vanished into the trees around us. And now, I'm on the verge of tears. I have no idea what we're going to do or how we are going to get out of this sticky situation. We began hearing lots of movement in the forest surrounding us. We knew that there were more of these things. We had to get out of there, but we're stranded out here on this lone back road. And now, they were approaching quickly. We had made the mistake of leaving everything back on our spot. We were seriously up the creek without a paddle. My friend was terrified. He just stood there petrified, his eyes wide open, looking at me saying, "We're gonna die out here." I realized in that moment, I still had my cell in my back pocket. I pulled it out, and thank God. I had a few bars. I immediately called 911, telling them we're two hikers who were lost and were being followed by a bear. We needed help. We could hear these horrific screams and yells of whatever was out there, making all sorts of terrible noises, howling back at us in this demonic tone, and it caused us to panic. We weren't sure whether to remain still or to wait until somebody showed up to rescue us. We could hear a lot more movement, now more than ever, and it was getting closer. And within minutes, probably sooner, we began seeing these glowing eyes watching us from the forest on both sides. Several sets of eyes, glowing green, yellow, and amber. I have never felt terror like that in my life. I would hear snarling and growling and gnashing, and then several of the figures began to move forward towards us. In that same moment, we saw some light coming in our direction, and we both instantly knew this had to have been an officer and that we were saved. However, we turned our attention back to the figures moving closer to us, and they did not cease. We started running towards the oncoming car, waving our arms like a crazy person, and they stopped. It was indeed an officer, and we were saved. He gets out of his car, and we start running towards him screaming, and he's putting his hand out, trying to get us to stop. We quickly explain there's no time, and we need to go now. These things are coming. That's when these creatures start howling and growling louder, and he responds to the noises in a way that I've never seen a man's expression go from concerned to terrified in seconds. The color of his face drained almost instantly as he saw for himself these beings in the night, approaching, closer and closer. Seeing the glowing eyes in these large figures, he alerted us to get in the back now. We jump in and he races off, asks us some basic questions, but we tell him our car is just a few kilometers away from here, back north. I've never met an officer who was so quiet and stricken with fear before until this event. He didn't say much, but dropped us off at our car. He said he'd be calling it in about a mile down the road and for us to explain what had happened. For our own safety, we stayed at a hotel that night and have not been back out to those woods since then, at least researching. Well, now, after this experience, there's no way anyone could convince me that there are not things out there in the woods like this that are very real. And whatever you do, don't go into the forest around midnight. These things are nocturnal alpha predators. I would not recommend anybody ever trying this. Those guys know what they're doing and will not hesitate to take somebody's life for trespassing their territory. I have no idea exactly what we encountered that night, and it was days before we could actually gather the courage to go back in and retrieve our equipment, which, by the way, was left completely intact and untouched. The camera and batteries, and all of our electronics that we had left there, were completely fried. They had been overloaded, something we have no idea how it happened. It had not rained. It's as if something had overcharged them. I just hope that there are more people out there that know what we've experienced. I've not been able to find anybody who knows anything close yet. Sorry for this story being so long. I had just gotten off work, was walking home in a dark area where there were some old abandoned warehouses by my house. Now, I would never walk down this road alone, but my girlfriend was with me. I would not have been too concerned even if I had been alone, because these warehouses are surrounded by electric fencing, and trust me, they are in working order. The road also has a street light every 20 or so feet. It's pretty well lit up. My girlfriend and I are walking down the road, talking about my work, when suddenly, she stops in her tracks. She froze up, looking scared, staring into the darkness of one of the warehouses. I asked her what was wrong, or if she saw something. I must admit that I'm rather predictable. She didn't answer me. She just stood there staring. And finally, after a few moments had passed, I decided to go check it out myself. I walked over to where she was standing and took a look into the warehouse that she was looking. There was nothing there, except dusty old equipment. Then, out of nowhere, this ear-piercing shriek echoed from deep within. It was so loud that I could feel my own chest vibrating. It hurt, and this high-pitched scream made my brain hurt. I looked back at her to see if she had heard it, but when I turned to look at her face, my blood ran cold. Her eyes were wide open in terror, and she just stared into the darkness with this horrified expression frozen on her face. She turned around, grabbing me by the arm, and tried pulling me away from this place as fast as she could. At first, I didn't want to go with her. I wanted to know what was making the noise, but after hearing it again for myself, there was no way I was staying here. I mean, the girl practically drugged me the entire way home, and I didn't say anything. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it wanted to escape from my chest. When we got back to her place, she locked all the doors, turned on every single light in the 10-mile radius, and wouldn't let me leave without going with her. I spent the night there. Nothing else happened during the rest of the night. I'm not exactly sure what she saw. She would never tell me, but it was obviously something that really disturbed her. So I'm going to say that we saw a dogman. I think she heard the noise and started seeing shadows of it moving all around. When she looked at its face, or so I'm guessing, based on her reaction, she saw it plain as day. I just heard the noise and got scared when she started seeing whatever she was seeing. In fact, the next morning she wouldn't talk to me about it. She got really quiet every time I brought it up about what we saw over the next few days. Eventually, I just stopped mentioning it. I could tell that she was upset by it. It's been a few months now since this happened, and things seem somewhat normal. We still talk about work from time to time, but that's about it. Not sure if she will ever be able to get past whatever it is she saw, or what caused her fear. But who knows? Maybe one day when the timing's right, she'll be ready to talk. Back in 2001, my buddy and I decided to go on a frog gigging trip. We loaded up the back of my brat with 2 5-gallon gas tanks, tents, fishing poles, shotguns, just in case, lanterns, cots, walkie-talkies, chairs, everything. We were ready. It was already dark when we left for our hunting spot, about an hour southwest of where we lived at the time. It was my property, where me and my 2 cousins had found numerous fossils over the years. It held good memories. That night, though, what awaited us there would change my life forever. We didn't just find frogs that night either, which is why this story is being told now. Unbeknownst to me at the time, what we found was not something terrifying, was worse. It started when my buddy and I got off the 4-wheeler and set up camp for the evening time. We had been there before, so we knew where we were going. Making a fire is always nice after spending hours in the hot sun gigging frogs. Plus, on top of that, it's illegal to shoot firearms within city limits, which is why they came along this trip. About an hour into sitting around a glowing fire pit, a mysterious red glow appeared far off in some trees near a huge pit mine from long ago, all grown over now with brush, and small as tall as 10 feet high. We thought nothing of it at first, just some people walking around with flashlights or fire. I'm pretty sure there was nobody else for miles, and we both immediately had a weird feeling we were being watched. We walked over to the four-wheeler, got out the walkie-talkies, turned them on, trying to look casual about it. As we started talking back and forth, we heard something huge crash into the brush and trees running straight toward us. It sounded like a really big animal. There were almost human-like screams mixed in with it, through what seemed to be getting closer much faster. It's hard to describe what happened next, but I'll try my best. When whatever it was launched itself from the trees and brush at us, it looked like something out of a horror movie. The closest thing I can compare it to is something from The Exorcist. Eyes all white, blood coming out of its mouth and nose while screaming. Its body appeared human but very contorted and deformed in what appeared to be agony. This thing looked like a misshapen naked human, limbs all bent, contorted, with deep white and black eyes, and almost a featureless face. My buddy jumped behind me when he saw it coming straight for us. I cocked the shotgun and fired into its chest before running back towards the four-wheeler to get away. As soon as this thing felt the impact of the buckshot, it turned around, screaming, running back into the woods. I have never heard any human being scream as loud as that did, nor have I ever been so afraid. It didn't seem very tall, maybe no more than 5'10" or 5'11", like me, but very featureless, no hair or anything, just a deformed body. That's all I can remember for now. Maybe I'll remember more as time passes. I promise you, though, that nothing short of a bullet will stop whatever it is we saw. Please, use extreme caution if you plan to investigate this firsthand. I've never heard or seen that thing again after this night, but me and my buddy could not sleep for the next few days, and still to this day, if I see anything in the woods at all, I throw up a prayer to God asking to make sure the safety of me and my loved ones are okay. And if something is out there, may God help me. Please be careful who you send this to. We do not want any more people getting hurt because of whatever this thing we saw that night. It's bad enough sometimes somebody dies out here by themselves trying to get lost on purpose without worrying about whatever that thing was. Use extreme caution. As I said before, I don't think this thing will go down without a fight unless you kill it. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Again, use extreme caution. If you plan on making contact with this animal, whatever it seems is very aggressive and dangerous by our standards. What we saw could or could not be human. This also happened several years ago, not far from Falls Lake, just off of Highway 98 near Creedmoor. To this day, I still don't know what that thing was. If anything, it didn't look or sound human, that's for sure, but it still scared me almost as badly as looking into the eyes of that thing. I've never heard or seen anything like it before or since, and hope to never see anything like it again. My family and I were having a reunion at a fairly common campground at the Delaware Water Gap. Considering we used to go there pretty often when I was not much older than 7, the area and amenities were mostly familiar. What made this reunion particularly special was that my brother and 2 cousins, one in his late teens and another in her early 20s, were all home from college. My siblings and I had been wanting to do a proper camping trip, at least while we were here. We had just finished setting up our tents, and we were sitting around a fire pit. It was a gorgeous day, so we were all sitting around in picnic chairs and chatting. There's a lot of woods surrounding the campground, with trails leading to the nearby Delaware River. My cousin said she wanted to go for a walk, so my brother went with her, while I lagged behind with my parents. The two walked down one of the nearby trails when they both stopped suddenly, exchanging confused glances at each other before looking back forward to see what it was. They saw an unusually large dog standing on its hind legs right at the edge of where the forest meets the pathway. That alone was enough to freak them out, since it's not something you see every day. But then, they noticed this dog had a very strange looking face, wrinkled and bony looking, and resembled some sort of skeletal creature more than a dog. My brother even said he could see how its teeth were rotted right through its gums, as the sides of its mouth were pulled back and rotting, almost in a snarl. It had these cold, dark eyes and looked more like black marbles staring unblinkingly at them. They stood there, completely frozen on either side of this thing, for what felt like forever, before it finally dropped down on all fours and walked away into the forest, with an odd, almost strange limp. Well, after they both calmed down, especially my brother, we started heading back to the campground. The whole way back, he insisted that this creature had been stalking them, and that it was by far not what you would call a dog. Its ears were too long and kind of pointy looking, like elf ears. If anybody knows his horror movies, elves are pretty much next to zombies on his list of most feared creatures. Its tail was also strange, not like what you'd expect of a canine. He claims it was more like a lizard than a dog, but that it was still upright like a person. As for my cousin, she said it was even scarier up close. She could see how deep some of its wrinkles were, and that under all those open scars of pus and skin, it was sickly looking. The color of its eyes and the yellowish-green slime oozing out of its wounds, like it was hurt or badly wounded, or emaciated even. It made her feel powerless to look away, or even cry out, until it finally disappeared. At least, that's what she told us as we walked back home together after dark. She definitely did not want to get into the woods by herself. Also, I should add that while we were sitting up our tents, some of my family went for a swim in the nearby river and had come back with some strange tales about the wildlife out there, which they declined to go into further detail on. The creature definitely looked more like a human dog than the other way around. As for why I believe it was this cryptid, my cousin and brother were traumatized what they saw, to say the least. And while my brother didn't tell me right away, he finally did admit that what had set him off so badly at first was the creature's mouths being wide open, as if it were about to attack them, let alone the general appearance of this thing. He said it was so disgusting and rotting looking, it horrified him. I'm a security guard, and I work the night shift. It was around midnight when I saw this thing running across the back of the parking lot. At first, I thought it was a man-wolf or something, but come to find out later on, after my shift had ended, I began to research the creature online. What I had seen earlier in the night turned out to be some kind of Dogman. What? No, it wasn't a man-dog. Here's a little background about me before we get into this further. My name is Jason. My last name redacted for anonymity. I'm 35, although people would say I look in my early 40s. A petite build with an average height of 5'10". Unfortunately, my face shows signs of life wear and tear, let alone the fact that I've spent most of my time living on the streets. First off, I'm a recovering drug addict. Years ago, before this incident happened, I was homeless and doing whatever it took to get money for my next fix, or even just some food to eat. While struggling with addiction and homelessness, an opportunity presented itself. A security firm hired me as one of their nighttime security guards at a local mall here in Vegas. I was required to patrol the premise every hour on the hour. There had been reports of people trying to break in, and some weird-looking animal creatures nobody could really describe. Something like a half-dog, half-man was how some of my colleagues described it, which I thought they were totally pranking with me. Yeah, right. So, as a result, Whenever I showed up at the back of the mall to check on things, there would be nobody around, except for me. Since security consisted of just myself working nights, at this point, business had been slow recently. I had all the time in the world to actually look into more what was going on. So, on the encounter night in question, on my patrol, I turned the corner to walk up an unlit alley behind one of the buildings in the mall when I heard a noise. Something was there. I thought it was a person, so I drew my weapon. Whatever it was, it ran down the other end towards me. That's when I saw its eyes, glowing like hot coals, set deep within its head. They were not only intensely bright, but full of anger, hate, evil even. The closer this creature came to me, I felt fear overwhelming every part of my body. Said fear paralyzed me, unable to make any move or sound at all, except for trying desperately to gasp for air. This is why security guards should never go out alone. When it got about 20 to 30 feet away from me, it stopped running and just stood still as a statue. At this point, I was more afraid than ever. Something about how it stood there and stared at me, looking into the void of my soul, like it knew everything about me. It scared me to death. After standing there for what seemed like an eternity, the creature slowly started walking back towards me again, with its head cocked back and forth, like the curious dog it was. Or creature, I should say. All I could do is continue to stare at this thing in complete silence and disbelief. It made its move. It jumped up and I took a couple shots. I swear, I saw it go back down on all fours after each shot. And when I turned to run away, it got up again and chased me. From there, I'm lucky I made it back inside the mall. It chased me after, but I hid back inside completely. I was scared out of my mind. I didn't know if this was an alien or a zombie or what this was. I never believed in cryptids until my encounter. Now, I'm a believer. Of course, after seeing what I saw for myself, it felt like something straight out of an episode of The Twilight Zone or The Outer Limits. It's true what they say. Seeing is believing. I believe what I saw was a Dogman because, number one, it looked like a dog and walked like one too. It also had the same body structure as one, except it was upright, standing on its back legs with hocks, very muscular in build, with huge arms. The creature's eyes glowed, and also it looked like something out of Dante's Inferno. When it chased after me, I swear, every time I would go to turn around to shoot at it, it would go down with each shot. If this thing wasn't some sort of hellspawn, then why did it scare me? I felt like something out of an episode of The Twilight Zone, like I said. It still gives me the creeps. I know there are plenty of Dogman sightings, just do your research on them. These things are not only real, but very dangerous. People should stay far away from them if they can help it. I know that was my plan after seeing this thing for myself, which is precisely why I have not gone out to look for it again. I'm too scared. All in all, if you do not go looking for these things, unless you have some sort of wish or want to become extinct. Now that I think about it, this thing looked a lot like what's depicted in the movie of The Howling, a horror movie made back in the 1980s. At least that's what it reminded me of. This creature was also not a werewolf. It had the same eyes and body structure, or fur as one you'd expect from the movies. But it could also move around on all fours like it did, and easily alternate between 2 legs and 4, as it did while chasing me. It looked more like something out of a movie than it did real life. Either way, it scared me badly. I won't go looking for this thing ever again. It was a warm summer night. I remember it. I went out with my dogs to take them for their last summer run. It was about 2 a.m, and I saw something that caused me to stop dead in my tracks. Let me try to paint this picture for you. The town where I live is right by Lake Ontario. which makes for some great scenery along most of the major roads. On one of the side roads are large open fields filled with small wooded areas between them. There are all different sorts of wildlife here, including Canadian geese, foxes, coyotes, skunks, raccoons, even black bears have been spotted, as well as dogs running off the leash, running around, including pit bulls. But there's also an urban legend that covers all of this land, called the Dogman. As the story goes, the Dogman is a creature that looks like the canine version of the Grim Reaper, or so I've been told. This creature stands between 7 and 10 feet tall, solid black eyes and fur as dark as the night. Some stories say it has claws instead of hands. Some say it howls at the moon. But most agree on one thing. If you see the Dogman, your final hour is upon you. Or so I was always told growing up. The Dogman isn't just a part of Midwestern legend. Well, let me tell you, I wasn't exactly feeling courageous just then. Now, my dogs are big enough to protect themselves. Both are Great Danes, and after all, I'd rather not be around if they decided to fight something that was bigger than either of them. My heart beating in my chest, I quietly reached for the whistle I keep on my lanyard around my neck, which did me exactly no good because, as it turns out, my dogs had already seen what I was looking at. As soon as they looked up from their sniffing and noticed this thing standing only a few feet away from us, they immediately ran towards it without so much as a single growl. It would have been comical if these two gentle giants were our only concern at the moment. Despite their size and strength, both dogs fled the second this thing stood up on two legs, and they stayed close to my side, or rather under my legs. We slowly backed away from this creature, and I realized what it was. The Dogman, for its part, didn't move much at all. They say that if you meet the gaze of a wild animal, it will turn and run. But this thing matched it. It kept staring right back at me. And as we continued moving backwards, we eventually reached my car. But as soon as we were safe inside the doors, and I locked everything, both dogs, I think from the safety of the vehicle, started growling. And we sat like this for about 10 minutes before I finally could drive home. And this is when I saw it cross the road in front of me, casually, and disappear into the trees on the other side, almost as if it was trying to taunt me. And both of my dogs were practically glued to the window. I had no idea what we were dealing with until it really began moving toward us. It was completely silent, giving me such a sense of dread. I wanted to get away from this thing as soon as possible. My dogs appeared just as frightened by this thing. They never took their eyes off it, and did nothing to stand up for themselves. Even though both were huge Great Danes, they cowered under my legs while we backed away slowly, away from this terrifying beast. It would be a few moments before I was calm enough to drive home. But when I saw this creature disappear into the trees across from me, that's when I knew it was time to get out of there. I drove a short distance down the road and stopped in my tracks. Thank God nothing else had been on the road, or we would have ran over something or someone. I was so worked up about what had happened. I only wanted to get home, but I had to make sure nothing dangerous was on the road. It took me yet another 15 minutes before I finally found the courage to drive the rest of the way. Well, if I'm being honest, I never really believed in Dogman before. Then again, why would I? It's not like there's any proof that this creature exists. At least, that's what I used to think. Maybe now I'll believe a little more after that experience. I guess my biggest concern with this whole thing was my dogs. Of course they were okay, but the way they were cowering, let's just say it will take some time for them to get over their fear of being so close to whatever it is we saw that day. And who could blame them? Just looking at it put an awful feeling in my stomach. I never got a good enough look to be able to describe it. All I know is that thing was huge, black, and had pointy ears sticking out of its head. Other than that, all I can make out were the dark shadows of its body against the tree. You can bet yourself there was nothing friendly waiting inside its mouth. The fangs made terrible hissing noises between each growl. I had no urge to stick around long enough to find out where it was going, or what it was going to do next. I've heard some people say that it's a werewolf, while others call it a dogman. To be honest, both sounds ridiculous, but after this, who knows? All I know is that whatever this creature was, the rumors about how dangerous it is doesn't seem too far-fetched anymore. So, if you happen to be walking in this area anytime soon, don't make the same mistake I did. Keep your dogs on their leashes, even when they are huge. If your pets end up being dinner for this monster, then chances are you'll be next. I'll always keep my eyes peeled for this thing, because now I know they're real, and the chances of me running into this thing again are probably higher than I would like. This was a long time ago, but the memory still sits so fresh in my mind. It was mid-afternoon on a Saturday, and I had just turned off the main road onto an old dirt service road that ran through several acres of undeveloped land surrounding a nearby neighborhood. Suddenly, I noticed some movement off to my right end of the street. It was a dog, but no, it wasn't. I slammed on my brakes, stared out at this giant beast as it walked towards me, along the side of the road with its head down low. Its tail was kind of tucked back, and I had a hard time deciphering just what kind of dog this was. As it grew closer, I could tell something was wrong about this thing. It reminded me of a bear because of the size. It was huge, but the way it was hunched over made it seem even bigger. Its body kind of reminded me of a mastiff, just incredibly muscular, except it was much larger than any mastiff. My immediate reaction was to duck down in the seat and cover up my head with whatever I had at hand on the front seat. But I didn't. This thing met eyes with me and stared at me, but seemed calm. I wasn't sure what it wanted, so I stupidly stayed put in an attempt to gather my senses and figure out where I needed to go. This thing leaned back on its haunches and even looked at me deeper. It stared deeply into my eyes for a few seconds, before slowly pulling itself back down on all fours and continuing towards me. That is when fear fully kicked in. In a panic, I stepped on the gas pedal, threw the car in reverse, and quickly backed up about 50 feet or so, speeding forward back onto the main road. I caught one last glimpse of this thing as it turned around to stare at me once more, and then disappearing. I ultimately saw a dog-like creature, large and hairy. It had a very distinct hunch to its back, and the shoulders were hunched really up high. It also had an extremely large head with pointed ears that stood straight up. Its eyes were dark in color, and it had a very strong, foul stench. I would say it was maybe 6 to 7 feet tall overall, but not gargantuan. As soon as I saw this thing coming, I slammed on my brakes and stared at it. I was so shaken by what had just happened, I went straight home and told my husband about it. He thought something must have spooked me, but now he's not so sure since I've told him many times before about all my other run-ins with these unknown creatures over the years, which, by the way, this isn't my first rodeo. Since then, I no longer try and turn down any dirt roads or wooded trails if I'm out driving alone in an area. If anything, within a mile radius of where I am. I don't want to leave a story behind. I felt like it didn't want anything to do with me at all, but I was not about to take any chances after what happened. So, I got myself out of there. My brother-in-law has actually told me about these things he's seen when he was younger. He grew up on this small farm with his family, and he would see some of the strangest animals out there by pig pens on the backside. He would always tell me that these creatures he saw looked like large deformed dogs, but bigger than any dog you could imagine. He also saw something one time while driving down the same dirt roads that had huge paw prints next to them. At first, he thought they must have belonged to a dog, but later realized just how big they were, considering that's what spooked him so much. I just think there is way more to creatures out there that exist than what we've ever been told. I think we as people need to stop dismissing all these crazy stories like they're nothing more than a joke. It's time we take these things seriously and start looking for answers, even if it takes us in a direction that doesn't make sense at first. It just might be that piece of evidence that leads us straight into the truth. This happened in late March of 2017. A group of friends and I went up to a farm that they have about 45 minutes from where I live. They go up there every now and again to hang out, drink beer, and enjoy the wonderful star show at night. After about 10 minutes of being at the farm, my friend noticed something running on all fours up by the barn, which is only about 50 yards away from where we were sitting around the fire. He said it wasn't anything he had seen before, so he had asked me if I knew what it was. I didn't have a clue. We decided to get in his truck and drive down closer to see what it was. We got out with a couple of flashlights and started walking right towards the barn when we saw it again. This time, it was standing up on two legs, roughly 75 yards away from us. And as soon as it stood up, we both just froze. What I saw can only be described as a monster. It was tall, at least 7 feet tall. Not completely furry, but it definitely had hair. It looked to weigh roughly 400 pounds. It had very wide shoulders and thick arms that appeared to hang down to its knees. Its face was human-like, but with larger than normal eyes and a nose, also much larger than any humans I've ever seen. Kind of like half wolf, half human. The teeth sticking out of its mouth could only be described simply as fangs. After seeing what it looked like, all of us, we all ran back to the truck, driving off, leaving the fire roaring only roughly 50 yards away. The entire place is pretty open, surrounded by thick forest and cornfields on all sides. What are we dealing with here? A dogman, a werewolf, or a bigfoot? The answer, I don't know. But I live around 2 hours from Michigan, so you can imagine how this freaked me out. And trust me, I have heard more stories than you can imagine, all about the Michigan Dogman. I always just thought it was a tall tale. Now, I'm seriously rethinking that. Back before the pandemic, life as we all knew it was much different. I spent a lot more time outside than I do now. But even that houses its own nightmares. I'll never forget this morning that I'm about to tell you about. I'm what you would call a huntaholic. It doesn't matter what time of year, but especially in the fall, winter, and spring months. I love to hunt coyotes, turkeys, deer, you name it. And I always seem to be carrying around my rifle and 12-gauge shotgun. It was around this time that it happened. It was 7:30 a.m. on a Saturday morning, October 22nd to be exact. I had just gotten home from working the night shift, and my grandparents' land is directly around me. So hunting on their land is always this amazing experience. Not only do they own over 100 acres, but 90% of it is covered in very thick wild terrain, making it great for finding game trails, setting up scout points, and you name it. They live very close by, and it's not more than just a 10-minute drive away from my door. I was more than willing to sacrifice some sleep for today's adventures. As I always do, I made sure to take a couple of snacks with me, so I wouldn't have to worry about stopping for lunch. My favorite are always ham and cheese sandwiches. I started the drive from my house to my grandparents', and then over to my parents' house, which is where I keep all of my hunting equipment and supplies, especially during the months I don't use them. I can't have them being gnawed on or destroyed by coyotes. I know it's kind of paranoid, but it's better than the alternative. After getting everything loaded up in the truck, I made my way down towards the wood-covered land, just beyond my grandparents' house. Anyway, I got to where I was needing to go with ease, and when I got out of my truck, something just did not feel right. It wasn't anything physical, like mosquitoes or having to pee real bad, or anything like that. It more had an atmosphere feeling about it, but I was too excited to care about that right now. I made my way up this hill, which is about 70 feet away from the road, and it's where I started my morning routine. I always start at the top of a hill with my gun pointed down towards an opening in between two trees, just so if anything comes into sight, I'll be properly prepared. Right when I got on top of that little hill, something snapped behind me, making me jump out of my skin quickly. Turning around with my rifle, pointing back at where the sound had come from. But nothing was there. I've never in my life felt so on edge while hunting. Usually, I'm very comfortable. Hunting to me is like second nature, and I've never been nervous doing it. This wasn't normal for me at all. I felt uncomfortable. Something was definitely going on. Something I wouldn't discover until just a moment or two later. I caught some movement close by, and I could tell by the distance it was at that it was incredibly large. I crouched down, pulled up my scope, and looked through it in that direction. It happened to be one of the trees I was standing next to, and I saw something crouched down on all fours behind just a small grouping of trees, roughly 100 feet away from me. It had been so still that if I hadn't moved at all, I would have thought it was just a tree stump, or perhaps a large rock. But the fact that it wasn't, that's when my heart began pounding in my chest, and my body began quivering with fear. I could tell it started to move and shake, and it got up from its crouched position and got on all fours. Then turned towards me, making eye contact for a split second through the scope, before sprinting off into the woods at an unbelievably fast-paced speed, which is what caused me to panic, pull the trigger, without even thinking twice about it. It was easily the most terrifying experience I have ever had in my entire life. To me, it felt like something just wanted to play with me. You know, when you kind of mix fear into things, it can go wrong very quickly. This thing looked like some sort of bear or wolf. I don't exactly know, but it scared me badly. I don't know exactly what it is that lives back here in these parts of the woods, but I'm positive it isn't anything human, or normal people aren't capable of hunting. That's my story, guys. I don't think I'll ever be going back there for a while. Late one night, I was watching TV, and I heard something or somebody out on my porch. I quickly sat up, muted my TV to see if I could hear it again. Sure enough, I could confirm that something was out there. I got up slowly and tiptoed towards the door. The noise stopped for a few seconds, and when I opened it, the noises started up again. Slow scratching, like metal on wood. I turned around to grab my flashlight that I kept by my bedside at night. Once I grabbed it, I turned around quickly to see what the creature was, but it wasn't there. So, I ran inside and grabbed my gun. I had no idea what that thing was. So, once I got into my room, I locked the door behind me. A little while later, something started scratching on my window right outside of it. It was really loud too. It sounded like somebody trying to get into my house. I called 911 immediately. The dispatcher told me to stay in my room and keep the door locked. So I did. Police showed up and looked around, of course, but didn't find anything. It ended with them telling me, if anything happens, to just let them know. Yeah, sure. Shortly after they left, however, the scratching continued, and it continued more. The scratching on my window continued until around 6 a.m. Once morning rolled around, I walked onto my porch cautiously. There were 4 scratch marks which started at the very bottom of my window. They're very strange scratch marks for sure, but they're not as creepy as what had happened next. At about 9 a.m. that same day, only a few hours later, I stepped outside, exhausted, wanting to really get some air after being cooped up all night. And just as I'm closing the front door behind me, something large dashes across my yard from one side into the woodline on the other property. It looked like this massive jet black dog. Its proportions looked nothing like a dog. I only say dog because of the head, and it having a shape kind of like a German Shepherd crossed with a Doberman Pinscher. Its proportions didn't make any sense. It reminded me if a human tried to run on all fours. I didn't believe in Dogman before this happened, but there's just no denying it anymore. I got a picture of it, but you can't really see it well because it's so far away. But if you zoom in though, you can make out what looks like dog ears on top of its head. I don't know how to explain this other than to say Dogman. I'm not sure if there are more of them or not. I just hope I don't end up finding more of them anytime soon. On the evening in question, there was a very bad thunderstorm. I was driving home from work, and I live in a very rural area, about 10 minutes up the road on top of this large hill. Well, I had just reached the crest of the hill when all of a sudden, it became dead silent. This feeling washed over me, like something was watching me or following me. There were no cars in front of me or behind me, for that matter, nor could I see anybody else around. As I started down the hill, I slowly began to press harder on my brakes because out of nowhere, this huge black dog, this wolf-like creature, comes running across the road directly in front of my vehicle. Now, it's hard to tell how fast I was going. Because it happened so quickly, I knew that it went bounding off into the trees with these huge leaps. Not running, but bounding. I thought, there's no way that's a normal dog. The sighting stuck with me and disturbed me. When I got home, my wife was outside working in the garden. I stopped and asked her if she had seen or heard anything like that. She told me no, and I told her more about this huge dog that ran in front of my car, after briefly explaining what it is that I saw. She then tells me that she actually has, and she's seen this huge dog on several occasions, but only ever at night, and she thought that people would think she was crazy, so she just refrained from ever talking about it. My wife informed me that one evening, as she was driving home, she saw this thing on the side of the road. She said it looked like a large dog, but that it wasn't. The creature stood on 2 legs and was as tall as a man, but hunched over, eating a dead deer. She said it didn't notice her as she slowed to avoid hitting it, because it appeared right around a bend. That's when I got scared. I've heard all about these things being spotted all throughout western Kentucky and even southern Missouri, but never this far south until now. I didn't say anything, and she told me that wasn't the first time she had seen these things. She doesn't like to talk about it. I guess I can't blame her. Well, that night, as we're lying in bed, she's sound asleep and snoring, and I'm laying there awake, my mind racing, and I just have this intense bad feeling building in my gut, like my skin crawling. My mind would just not stop replaying that visual over and over again in my head of what I saw that day. I just felt this terror in my body, like something was very, very wrong, but I could not pinpoint it. We have a very large window in our room. It's kind of shaped like a half pyramid, and the moonlight beams right through onto our bed, so it wasn't pitch black. I can see across our bedroom to another large window with the drapes pulled back. Now, normally we have our drapes closed, but this night, we must have forgot. As I'm staring off in the distance at this big, bright glowing moon, I see something move right by our window. The movement catches my attention, and I react and look. And I see a shape that looks somewhat like a man's body, but it was huge, taller than the window, at least 7 feet tall. And I noticed something else. The figure is very muscular. Whoever it is, it clearly works out. I'm thinking to myself, red alert, an intruder. And before I could reach to my right in my dresser, where I keep my revolver, this thing moves and crouches down a little. And that's when I get the full look. Its face. It's just pure evil with these glowing eyes. It's as if I was witnessing the devil himself. It had human-like hands that it pressed against the glass, and its face was like that of a wild, evil dog. And it just stood there, staring at me, with the most intense eyes I've ever seen, trying to get into my mind. I couldn't even process it at the point, but this had to have been the same creature I had seen earlier in the evening. And to think, that sighting happened only about 5 or so minutes away from the house. Now, I should mention this real quick that when it first saw me, as it was running across the road, it looked over at me and kind of made an expression. It was a devilish one. I had a hard time going into more detail because of how it scared me so badly. It's an expression you give to somebody who you recognize, but there was evil intent behind it. I don't know how to portray such an expression, and made by a large dog was more than disturbing. This thing pressed its face up against my window, then looked over at the side of the house where the back door is, looked back at me for a moment, and kind of grinned, as if it just said, "Gotcha," in its head. Then it disappeared. I don't remember if I had locked the back door that night. I don't always, since we kind of live on a larger piece of land and it's tucked away on a not so busy road. The last thing I was ever worried about was intruders. We never had them out here. But I always felt safe keeping a loaded gun nearby, just in case. I was filled with so much primal fear. My instincts kicked in, and I knew I had to kill this thing, or it was going to kill me. I shot up out of bed, not my own doing, but my body just reacting. I grabbed the revolver from my bedside, which I keep fully loaded at all times, ran to where the back door was. Before I could even make it to the back door, I saw the handle violently jiggling and the door being pressed in. Luckily, I had locked the door, but this thing was trying to get into our house. So I leaned up against the wall next to the door, waiting patiently. And then I heard it. The first thing to hear come out of its mouth was this low grumbling growl, and it shook my bones and made the hair on my neck stand straight up. It appeared to be some sort of animal, but the sound was very deep, as if the devil himself had vocal cords. That sound alone, just remembering this as I typed this up, sent chills up my spine and caused me to shake more than I was already shaking. After the growl, there was this horrendous grunt, as if 2 animals were fighting over food, except both voices were coming from the same being. It's like one noise got caught in its throat, while another shot out of its mouth with an echoey effect. The door jiggled and continued to rock for a few more moments, before stopping. I took a deep breath, flicked on the light outside, opened the door, pointing my gun, and fired 3 shots. Bam! 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 I heard the most horrendous scream you could ever imagine. It sounded worse than the screams you'd hear from monsters in a horror movie, and this thing began screaming all the way back to the woodline on the far side beside the house. I'm assuming I hit it, based on the noises, even though it had stepped outside the reach of the light. I fired 2 more shots in the distance, just to make sure it was running away. This event has changed our lives forever. This event has also opened up a whole new world for us. Now we know that these things are real. Completely filled with adrenaline and fear, I paced around the living room all night, revolver in hand, ready to go for round 2 when this thing would come back. But it never did. It was kind of a blurry passage of time, but I remember my wife awakening around 6 in the morning. I'm sitting there in the chair, wide-eyed, exhausted, but being kept up by adrenaline. She's asking me, why do I have the revolver in my hand? What happened? I calmly explained that I had to chase away an unwanted intruder and to not be alarmed. She didn't buy my story. I tried to assure her that everything was fine. I didn't sleep at all. Once the sun was fully up, now it was roughly 7 or 8 in the morning, I went outside and over to where I had seen this thing to look for signs of blood or anything that would give me some sort of closure. There was nothing. Not even any tracks left behind by whatever this thing was. There was not a lot of detail that I could provide, because honestly, I felt like I blacked out after seeing this thing at the window. All my memories are kind of sketchy after that. But this is my story. I know what you're thinking. I'm nuts. No way would something like this ever happen. Well, if you saw what I saw, you wouldn't be able to deny it. And believe me, it was and still is the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. And trust me, I've seen some pretty grotesque things, like a man getting decapitated by a car in front of me. But that's for another time. I just hope this never happens again and that these things stay away from our house, or any other house that we buy for that matter. I'm not sure where I first heard about Dogman, and my family has lived in this area since the 1950s. You would think that we would surely have heard or saw something by now if there were such things. They say encounters with Bigfoot are rare, but I don't think Bigfoot try and violently break into people's houses, or do they? I still have vivid nightmares about this night, and I still fear this thing might be coming back. I've been thinking of moving, but am not sure where would be a safe place. Any thoughts? Finding time to sit down and write this hasn't been easy, but I'll do my best. This was back in the fall of 2018, and it still gives me vivid nightmares. I just got done hanging out at a good friend's house for the evening and was heading home. I got down the road, realized I was running low on gas. So, after quickly checking my surroundings to make sure everything looked okay, I pulled into the first open gas station. After getting out of my car and walking up to the pump, I see this big dog staring at me from across the street, cloaked in the shadows. At first glance, it appeared normal, but then it began crossing the street towards me, and I knew something just wasn't quite right with it. Something about its eyes gave it away. They were darker than usual. They kind of had a red hue to them, an iridescent shine. It also had very long canine teeth. They didn't look quite right either. The dog continued coming closer, so naturally, I began backing away slowly, without breaking eye contact. After what felt like an eternity, I was finally able to get the gas pump open and put gas in my car. At that point, this dog stopped coming towards me, but it was still staring intently at me, while moving its head around as if checking me out. Now, the entire time I'm filling gas in my car, I'm just begging for the pump to hurry up and finish, so I can get out of there, ASAP and be done with all of this. This weird dog had just continued to linger in the darkness, stare at me while this was going on. So strange. I was very unnerved and creeped out for sure. I finished filling up, jumped back in my car, and headed home, which was no more than 12 minutes away. This thing was still there though, staring at me as I drove off. I wasn't sure what I thought of the whole ordeal until later that night. I couldn't sleep. It just kept replaying like a movie over and over again in my head. I just want to get across how strange this dog was, and not because it looked like a regular dog, but the whole thing looked off. You could tell this wasn't a normal dog. Now, I couldn't see every detail due to the thickness of shadows, but I just had a bad feeling. The time was January. That's when I saw this thing for the first time. I was on a drive up to Arkansas from my hometown in Louisiana. I had my wife and 3 kids with me. My dad was following us in our other car. It was about 2:30 a.m., and we were going past Pine Bluff on Highway 10. The road is a 4-lane divided highway, about 40 feet wide with a divider that goes down the center. This is where our encounter had happened, and my daughter was the only one up, and she saw it first. When we asked her what she was looking at, she said, "There's a big dog on the road, Dad." I looked but didn't see anything for a few seconds. And then suddenly, I noticed this dark grayish figure running on all 4s, going eastbound towards us. It ran with incredible inhuman speed, disappearing just into the woods, past where our car had just passed. He, or it, had a very thin body, long arms that were about the same length as its legs. He also was very tall, at least 8 feet. His body looked to be the color of ash, and he had a big head, with virtually very little hair. It was shaped somewhat like a dog, but not really. His face was covered in shadows, so it was hard to make out any real features other than it was very dark or shadowed by his massive height. The only sound I heard it make was the thumping noise you would hear if somebody was running straight through. We all saw him running across the road, then disappear into the woods, past where our car had just passed by before we got to him. I could tell that my daughter and wife were scared. They were both sitting up very straight, looking around in every direction to see if they could see him again. I was scared too, but I also wanted to get off the road. He made me feel something really bad was about to happen. So I sped up to get past the area where we saw him. We talked about it some more the rest of the drive, but it was much more quiet after. I think we were all a little spooked, having just seen a real-life werewolf run by the road. My dad in the car behind us also called me after I got home, said he had seen it too when passing by in his car behind us earlier in our trip. He said that he thought it might have been somebody in a costume until he saw just how fast it was, realized that no human is capable of such speeds. I think it's important to note that we were in the city limits of Pine Bluff, less than a mile from the Air Force Base. I don't know if that has anything to do with anything, but I thought it was at least worth mentioning. I had seen some weird things in the sky my whole life as a kid. Never thought much of them. I mean, the concept and ideas of UFOs have always stuck with me. But until this summer, they began happening much more frequently. My husband and I went for a walk on our property one night. It was meant to be romantic, until we saw something very strange. We stood there in disbelief as we watched this strange-looking figure move quickly on all 4s, like some sort of rabid ape or monkey, with tremendous speed. We stood there in shock as this dark figure flew from tree line to tree line. It was a really cool day, and then I looked up into the sky, and I see this saucer-shaped object that seemed to be following in the direction this thing disappeared into, across the pasture. I'm not one to fantasize about stuff like this. It is just something that happened during an average walk on our property. I thought it might be worth mentioning, because you seem to have had so many encounters. I just wanted to share my experience with you. Thanks. I was on my way to a party back in 2013, and I saw something I will never forget. This thing was walking across the street in a dark area, surrounding a small pond. It ran really weird. It had its arms stretched outwards, like it was trying to balance itself during this sprint. I could tell it was running super fast. I saw it move across the street in only a matter of seconds. It looked like what you would expect a Dogman to look like, had you Googled it. But the thing I saw had very little hair on it. Or if so, it was so short you couldn't really make out much in the darkness. It kind of reminded me of an ostrich when they run with their wings spread out. But this creature didn't have wings, and it wasn't running like that, but in a similar fashion. It definitely reminded me of a werewolf from behind, but it didn't have any hair on its back, from what I could tell. It seemed like its skin was more mangy and rotted. It turned slightly for half a second as it ran by the road shoulder. The only reason why I know that is because my family hunts, and we go out a lot. In fact, my brother has been hunting with his rifle for a few years now, and he has never saw something like that creature ever, which he has his own set of encounters I'll have to share with you sometime. I have seen a lot of deer in the past here, and this was not a deer. It spooked me pretty bad, and I had to hide my fear when I got to the party. I remember my friends saying that I wasn't acting myself, so I just told everybody I didn't feel too great, that I thought I was coming down with the sickness, and there was no way I was going to tell them I had seen a real-life, living werewolf. This was back in August of 2015, while camping at a state park, east of Mena, Arkansas. My wife woke me up at approximately 4 a.m., telling me she had just seen something run across the campground from west to east close by. Now, it was very dark out, except near the middle of our campsite, where there were some lights on, and an electric pole. It wasn't as dark as some other spots throughout the campground. The moon was up that night, but it wasn't very bright. I looked at my watch. My wife said she didn't hear anything, just saw something really big run across the campground, into the woods, right by our truck. I went outside and couldn't see or hear anything, not even the crickets, and that's not a good sign. So I walked to where my wife said it ran towards and started sweeping my eyes all through the wood. It was very dark, except where sunlight from a building on the other side of the park shone, so it was not as dark as you might expect in a forest, especially on the edge of those trees. I heard something moving through the brush and started walking toward it, slowly, while shining a flashlight on what was about 20 feet inside the tree line. I immediately identified what I was looking at. It was a large, very muscular dog-like animal, with dark fur, standing facing away from me, so I could not see its face or eyes. It was bigger than any wolf I had ever seen, by quite a bit. I tried to say something, but my voice caught in my throat. It scared me pretty bad just being there, and seeing that thing without noticing it first. When the creature turned slightly toward me, exposing its profile, that's when I realized I was looking at wasn't any sort of normal canine species of animal that you might expect to find. This thing looked like a darn werewolf. When it turned back around and started moving away from the light, I felt a tightness in my chest, and I took off running back to the campsite, where the safety of my wife and my tent waited. When I got there, my wife, curious, was asking what had happened. I didn't say much, just told her we needed to leave, put on our shoes, grabbed a few things from our tent, and then ran to the truck. In order to get to the main road, we had to drive through that part of the campground where I saw whatever it was standing. So we drove slowly with our high beams on for roughly 5 minutes, watching for any movement in or around the woods, but didn't see anything else. I have never been so scared of anything in my life. Hey, just wanted to say I'm a big fan of your show. And a friend of mine told me years ago about an encounter she had had with one of these creatures while camping up in the Ozark Mountains. The encounter occurred when she and her friends decided to go take a break from camping and go swimming in a small river that flowed nearby by the campsite. The ladies had been swimming for about an hour when my friend noticed what appeared to be a large dog walking slowly in her direction along the riverbank. She was neither alarmed nor frightened by this animal's approach. After all, it was not unusual for people who frequented this popular area to see various forms of wildlife near or around them. However, unlike other creatures like deer or raccoons and even bears, which would normally take flight at any sign of human presence, this animal showed no such signs of concern at the intrusion of his or her space. As this creature came closer, and my friend realized that it was much larger than any normal dog she had ever come across. Further, this creature appeared different from other dogs in its gait and what she can make out to be its face. At one point during the animal's approach, my friend said that it stopped walking towards her, but instead sat down on what appeared to be its hindquarters, making no effort to retreat as this human stranger encroached upon his or her surroundings. Eventually, sensing no hostility on behalf of this woman, the animal seemed quite comfortable with remaining within close proximity. Now, the two continued observing each other for what seemed like several minutes. My friend said that she felt a compulsion to run. She said she never quite felt fear like that in her lifetime. She wanted to run, but was literally frozen. She attempted to make sense of what this thing might be. She thought it could be a mountain lion, or perhaps a strange large dog. However, neither explanation made any sense to her, given the way the animal moved and its physical characteristics, such as its face and body. As she continued studying this animal, it suddenly occurred to my friend that the creature looked like a werewolf. She remembered seeing shows about creatures of this sort since she wasn't a horror movie watcher, and hadn't seen things like this since she was young. But she couldn't quite believe what her eyes kept telling her. Upon realizing what this animal might be, my friend and her friends retreated back to their campsite out of the water, and this strange wolf creature that was watching them disappeared without a trace from the spot it was last seen at on the river bank. They have no idea how it moved so quickly out of sight, or where it could have gone. She said what remained clearest in her memory was a sense of knowing that this creature seemed to be studying her, as if it knew everything about her. This story has always stayed with her, and it also helped me by her telling me cement my interest in the unknown. As many have experienced, once something unexplainable in your life is changed forever, once you know there are things beyond our ability to perceive at any given time or place, the world no longer seems safe or predictable. This is why people fear these things. They can't readily understand what they don't know, and what they don't understand scares them out of their wits. I believe personally, there are many species thought to be extinct, still existing in remote places all over the world, some more humanoid in appearance, and others quite primal, depending on the species. I don't think it's a coincidence that there are so many ancient folk tales about creatures like this in nearly every culture. These survivors of ancient times live among us today, while keeping to their own kind. It's common logic. If you can't see, it must not exist, right? Well, I believe humans coexist with other creatures quite peacefully sometimes. However, I also think that there is an underlying competitive nature to life itself, and it oftentimes finds other species at odds with one another. This could be due to competition for food sources, or mates, or both, which ultimately leads to confrontations between members of varying species. The fight for survival makes no distinction between one differently evolved creature and another. I think it's likely that more of these incidents go unreported for a variety of reasons, including a lack of tangible physical witness or evidence left behind to validate the experience. And more often than not, an encounter with one of these creatures is written off as a bad dream by somebody who feels they were simply imagining things or drifting off into sleep, never realizing that it was not the case at all. People see what they expect to see and hear what they expect to hear in many cases, because their minds are conditioned to do so, unless something forces itself on them against their will, which can be traumatizing for some people. I think this happens much more frequently than we might think, as most encounters between humans and other creatures can be attributed to a person either misinterpreting an entirely human event as something more sinister, or seeing something they want to see instead of what's actually there. The bottom line is that we can't say with any certainty that just how many different species of humanoid creatures exist around the world today. It's safe to say there are at least a few, and humans can, hopefully, coexist peacefully with some of them on occasion. The only thing we should fear, ultimately, is fear itself. But not all fears, like this story, are necessarily illogical and unfounded.